Hi, it's Tom here from Running Physio. Today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a slightly different method of setting our exercise loads and intensities for rehab for people that you're going to see in clinic using the reps in reserve method. Now, I must admit, this is something that I'm learning about, so I thought it'd be a good thing we could learn about together. I'm more of a kind of repetition max guy. I've done a lot of rehab through the years based on various different kind of repetition max ranges. You know, you might be familiar with some of the stuff we've talked about in tendinopathy, like starting at 15 rep max and building up to 12, 10, 8, etc. So I'm very comfortable in that region. But this reps in reserve training is an alternative method, which I think has some benefits to it. So I thought it'd be really good to share it with you today, share some of the research on it as well, and to see what you think. So let us know in the comments if you're using this method already. What are the pros and cons of it that you found? I've also put a link to our series of webinars on iliotibial band syndrome. You can get direct access to the first one of those by clicking the link if you want to find out more about managing that condition in clinic. Now, if we look at a lot of the research in trying to determine load in strength and conditioning in particular is often based on one repetition maximum, the maximum load you can lift just once with good technique. But there are some downsides with basing it on this. Particularly for us, we see people with pain, so it's going to be difficult for us to load them up and test one rep max. We might not have the kit to do it. They may have never done it before in the past, may be completely unfamiliar with to them. But also, actually, research suggests that one rep max scores actually do fluctuate based on things like sleep, fatigue, recovery, etc. So if we're basing our rehab on testing one rep max and they score particularly low, perhaps in that session because they're fatigued or tired, that's going to have a knock-on effect on the loads that we're setting. We're going to set lower loads perhaps than would be ideal going through the rehab. So really we want something that's perhaps a little bit more controlled by the patient, that's going to fluctuate a little bit more in line with things like fatigue, sleep, etc. And that's where things like reps in reserve are thought to be useful, because it's actually something determined by the patient, so it can take into account some of these fluctuations and can allow them to adjust on almost a session by session basis as they use it. So repetition in reserve, what is it? How do we work it? Well, it's based on a number of studies. There's a nice study by Zordus et al., and they put together this useful scale, which I think helps us to understand it. And what this scale is, it combines RPE, so rate of perceived exertion, which you see down the left-hand scale there, going to a maximum of 10, with the number of repetitions that the person feels that they have left remaining, the amount of reps they feel that they can still do. So that is their reps in reserve. So if you've got an RPE rating of 10, so maximal effort, here we're going to have 0 reps in reserve. That's as much as we can possibly do. Whereas we think an RPE score of 9, so pretty high up on that rating scale, means perhaps you've got about 1 rep remaining in reserve. 8 would be 2 reps remaining in reserve, etc. Now, as we get further down this scale, as the loads get lighter and we move further away from actual failure in terms of the lifting, it's known that this scale gets less accurate. So you see when we get down to kind of 5 or 6 out of 10 on the effort scale, we're looking at more of a range of maybe 4 to 6 reps remaining in reserve. And actually below that, the scale changes to look at either light effort with RPE 3 to 4 or little to no effort of an RPE score of 1 to 2. So it's quite useful to utilize this in terms of our instructions for patients. So typically, in some of the studies and things, they might recommend that people work with 1 to 4 reps in reserve, i.e. that they stop that set when they feel that they've got somewhere between 1 and 4 reps left available to them in the tank, if you see what I mean. Now, one of the benefits of this is we're stopping short of complete failure in each set, which helps to reduce some of the fatiguing effects that we'll have. And you can imagine if we're doing that, particularly in a novice athlete, it's going to take them quite some time to recover from doing multiple sets to failure. So it allows us to stop just short of failure, to reduce fatigue. And this can be particularly useful in our runners who are often trying to manage running alongside their rehab programs. So if they're tired, we might use a slightly higher reps in reserve number of perhaps 2 to 4 reps, leave 2 to 4 reps in the tank rather than taking yourself close to fatigue. Now, it is also recognised with the research that our more experienced lifters are going to be better and more accurate at determining the reps that they have left available to them. Novice athletes probably less accurate. And we do need some kind of anchoring process to get people used to this. Now, before we talk about how we might use this, I think it's important for us to recognize this. There are the right times, the right stages to bring this approach in. So if we want to integrate it into rehab and as part of anchoring the person so they can recognize how many reps they've got left in the tank, we need to be able to take them close to failure in that process. We're probably going to need to use a reasonable amount of load. So I'd recommend waiting till someone's at a point where they're less irritable. Perhaps you've started some work at some lighter loads, they can manage it, and you and they feel ready to push a bit harder. That's a good time to move on to this approach. In highly irritable patients with lots of pain that have responded poorly to load and have reacted to it, this probably isn't going to be appropriate just yet. You might want to put it on the back burner until things get a bit better. Now, the method that they mention in the research for kind of anchoring this, to kind of get people to get a good idea of what their reps in reserve are, is to get someone to work with a sub-maximal load and work and stop short of failure. So maybe, let's say you leave what they think is 2 reps in reserve, okay? And then you say, okay, well, let's repeat this again with the same load, and let's see how many reps it actually does take you to get to failure. So let's see actually how close you were with your estimate previously. And that act of taking people to actual failure is quite useful. It's thought to help them to kind of anchor themselves and know, okay, this is roughly how close I am to failure. This is roughly how many reps that I have left in reserve. So I think it's important to do that. It may be quite useful to do that across 2 or 3 different exercises within your rehab program. So for each of the different exercises, they get familiar with working out with their reps in reserve, and also with knowing what it feels like to work to failure. Now, we know there's lots of benefits in our rehab of improving load, in developing strength, etc. But this process can also be really good for confidence, to show people what their bodies are capable of, and also to show them how heavy they may actually need to be lifting to get close to the kind of ranges in terms of load that we'd want to get the changes that they want. So lots of benefits potentially from doing this. There's a really nice review paper from Helms et al., which I'll put in the comments, which takes you through these things in a little bit more detail. And what I've done is taken some of the recommendations from them to share with you in terms of what they suggest we use here for things like maximal strength, hypertrophy, endurance, and power development. So they're typically trying to combine reps in reserve with this kind of RPE score, just like that scale we looked at a few moments ago. So if they're looking at trying to develop maximal strength, in this paper, they're looking at lifting the heavier end of the spectrum, so perhaps between 1 and 6 rep max. And it is fair to say there is some evidence to suggest for maximal strength, we want to be lifting down this end of the spectrum. But again, pick the right patient appropriate for this. Typically, we need to build some tolerance at slightly lower loads first, but they need to be non-irritable. Now, here's then where we could use several different methods with the reps in reserve. So you could, for example, be working at true 6 rep max, which would be 6 reps with 0 reps in reserve, i.e. you can just do 6, you couldn't possibly do 7. Or you could be working similar kind of load level, so roughly 6 rep max, but doing 5 reps with 1 rep in reserve, or 4 reps with 2 reps in reserve. So they feel that the load is heavy enough that they probably could have managed another couple of reps in addition to those 4. Now, what they suggest then in Helms et al.'s paper is that for this maximal strength range, we're going to look at lifting and leaving 1 or 2 reps in reserve. They suggest you can go that bit heavier, work at 0 reps in reserve, but you want to make sure you're maintaining the technique, the quality, and the safety if you choose to do that. And you wouldn't want to do that all the time with people because of the fatiguing effects that it's likely to have. With hypertrophy, slightly different. So they're looking at higher reps typically, so 6 to 12 reps. And it does appear from the research that's training volume that's perhaps a little bit more important than training load for hypertrophy. So as a priority, we want to be able to maintain that higher training volume. And we may need to use a little bit more rest between sets in order to help us to achieve this. So we're looking perhaps at 6 to 12 reps with an RPE of 8 to 10 and reps in reserve between 0 and 2 reps in reserve. Now again, there's a little bit of a caveat with this. If you want to do 0 reps in reserve, i.e. you're lifting heavy enough that you've got nothing left in the tank, then you probably want to do that in the final set. So you're still able to keep good volume within that training session and good technique. Then in terms of endurance, they're recommending higher rep ranges here, so 12 reps or more, with shorter rest periods. So typically perhaps less than 2 minutes, because we're trying to help people to adapt and speed up their recovery between these exercise bouts. RPE scores can be quite high here of 9 to 10 with reps in reserve of 0 or 1 rep in reserve. So we're going to be looking then probably at lighter loads and more reps with this shorter rest periods to try and develop the endurance characteristics in particular. Now we'll add to this that we think that a lot of endurance adaptations will come from the sport itself, the running, the cycling, rowing, etc. So if you're pressed for time, I'd still probably focus for most people on building maximal strength, hypertrophy or power if they're doing quite a lot of endurance level training. And then finally on the list here, if we're trying to develop power, we've got to remember here that speed is an absolutely vital part of power. So we don't want to compromise speed by using very, very heavy loads necessarily. So you might actually set an intensity cap. So say, well, let's look at an RPE score, an effort score of 4 out of 10. So we're keeping the load relatively low. But in perhaps a more experienced lifter, if you're wanting to use heavy load, so you're looking at developing speed and strength and power at the same time, you might use 1 to 5 reps with an RPE score of 7 to 8 with 2 or 3 reps in reserve. The idea here is that we want to be able to maintain that speed, that quality of movement, and we might have long rest periods between each set to allow recovery, 3 to 5 minutes, something like that, because we really want to maintain the speed aspect here. So a little food for thought for you there in terms of how you might utilize reps in reserve in rehab. As I say, it's something that I'm learning about and finding quite an interesting topic. It's good to have these different options available to us. And I think the key thing is knowing how we can adapt it to each patient and how we can keep it simple enough that they understand it. One of the nice things about something like a reps in reserve idea is you can say, well, we want to keep it at a level where you're going to stop when you feel you can just about do 1 or 2 more reps in addition to what you're doing, for example. Then if you're getting to a point with the load that you're using that at, say, 12 reps or 10 reps, you feel you've got more than that, then it's a sign you need to up that load. So if you're getting to that 10 rep stage, for example, and you feel you could go on to do 13, 14, 15, it's too light. Push that load up a little bit more. If you're getting to that 10th rep and you can barely get that rep done, and we're not wanting to work with 0 reps in reserve, we might say it's a little bit too heavy. Let's go a little bit lighter so you feel you could get that 10th and maybe an 11th rep done as well. So it's ways just to try and adapt it to keep the intensity at the right level. And when you look at the other methods like percentage of 1 rep max, or if you're looking at repetition maximum ranges, like say using 12 rep max, the maximal load you can lift 12 times, what each of these three things seem to share in common is that when we look at rehab that we do with people, we often aren't actually getting close to the loads that all three of these approaches would actually recommend. So one thing I would take away from this video, whether you use percentage 1 rep max, whether you use repetition max ranges or reps in reserve like we've talked about, do try and make sure you're loading people enough to actually achieve the goal that you have. So it's going to be fairly heavy load if you're trying to build maximal strength, for example. It's going to need a good training volume if you're trying to build hypertrophy. It's going to need adequate speed if you want to develop power. So really think about making sure that we're getting those things in place, because I think when I reflect upon my practice, perhaps previous years before I was more familiar with strength and conditioning, I probably wasn't really loading people enough or really getting those training characteristics at the right kind of level to get the results we want. And things kind of get blurred out into one approach for all. And this is where things like 3 sets of 10 get criticized, because if it's just a blanket approach thrown out for everyone without any real thought of appropriate load, speed, time under tension, etc., you're not really going to get the results you want. Okay, thanks very much everyone for listening. As I said, we put a link to the iliotibial band series of webinars that you can check out. Do put your questions in the comments afterwards. I'll share that Helms paper and 1 or 2 other pieces of research in the comments afterwards. So thanks again for listening, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Bye for now.